That Grenfell moment, just tell people listening why you made that mistake, do you think?
Well, I think it came from the experience I'd had, really, as Home Secretary in dealing with other incidents, mainly, of course, terrorist incidents, where the key thing immediately is to make sure the law enforcement, the emergency services have everything they need.
You don't get in the way.
You don't get in the way, exactly. And so I went down and saw the fire brigade and the police and talked to them about what they needed. I did come back and say we were setting up the public inquiry as a result of that, but I didn't actually meet victims until the day and the day after that.
Let me ask you about language, because you also say that when you were Home Secretary, that use of the phrase hostile environment was one of those things you now regret. Can you explain again to people listening why you used the phrase and why you regret it?
Yes, and I wasn't the first person to use it. In fact, previous Labour government had used it as well. And it was used to describe the environment we wanted to set for those who were here illegally. It's only fair to people who come here legally that people who are here illegally are not able to, if you like, carry on living a life as if they've come here legally. And so it was aimed at a particular group of people. What, of course, happened was it came by some to be interpreted as more generally applying to people who had come in to live in the country. And that was a mistake, because that was never what was intended.
And language is very important in these things without trying to get into the actual policy behind it and all. What do you think of some of the language being used by some of your successors, the current Home Secretary, for instance, about migrants being an invasion, those kind of things? Because language does matter.
Well, it's not the language that I would use. And I have made one or two points about some of the migration policies and that have been brought up by the government. I have particular concern about their most recent legislation and its impact on the victims of slavery, for example.
And there was another phrase used by Robert Jenrick about cannibalising the compassion of the British people, which I thought was a strange phrase.
Yes, I mean, the British people have always been welcoming to people who are refugees, who are fleeing persecution. Obviously, what we see from a lot of people migrating to the country illegally is they're economic migrants. They're not fleeing persecution in the sense that one would normally recognise a refugee. I said when I was Prime Minister at the United Nations, I think we need internationally to have a better way, if you like, of differentiating between those who are refugees and those who are economic migrants. And we need to have a look again at some of the rules that we all operate on internationally.
We're going to have a new agreement at some point with the EU on this, aren't we, to ensure that we're all applying the same kind of rules to people crossing Europe and then arriving up on the English coast.
Yes, I mean, most of the people who arrive, obviously, particularly those coming in small boats, have been through other European countries. And obviously, a number of my colleagues will say, and this is right, that somebody who is genuinely fleeing persecution would be claiming asylum in the first safe country that they get to. But we do need to be talking to our European allies about this issue, which potentially will be exacerbated by climate change. We significant numbers are spoken of in future migration, and climate change could exacerbate that problem.
Yes, and may very well. Let me turn, if I may, to Brexit, which was the thing really at the heart of your prime ministership, those awful, awful weeks when you were trying to get a gentler deal, if I can put it that way, through the House of Commons. And by your account in this book, there was almost a kind of conspiracy by hardcore Remainers who just didn't want anything to do with Brexit at all, led by the then Speaker of the House, John Bercow, on the one side, and hardcore Brexiters who wanted the hardest possible Brexit. And together, they scuppered your deal, which you think would have made this country more prosperous and happier afterwards had it gone through.
Well, I was very clear when I became Prime Minister that I needed to deliver Brexit because the majority had voted for that. It was the democratic will of the people. But it was a close vote. And therefore, I always thought we should do it in a way that recognised the concerns that the 48% Remainers...
A sort of softer Brexit, in the word. Yeah.
Yes. And yes, I mean, I used to get slightly frustrated at the terms hard and soft Brexit, but very much that a deal that I thought could try to maintain as much of the advantages that we'd had of the freer trade, for example, with the European Union in the past as members, but try to maintain that good trading relationship for the future. Unfortunately, the deal I presented to Parliament was not accepted. And what happened over time was, you're right, the hardline Brexiteers wanted something hard, much harder. And the hardline Remainers saw an opportunity, perhaps to try for a second referendum and overturn the whole thing.
Yes. You don't let rip very much in this book, but you let rip at John Bercow. You call him a liar and a bully, and you accuse him really of twisting parliamentary rules to suit his own political agenda. Explain.
Yes, well, those are two different things in a sense, because the term of being a bully and a liar actually was the term used by in a report on him in terms of his behaviour towards his staff. And that was part of, I talk about other behaviour of MPs or behaviour of other MPs towards their staff and the issues that have arisen. But that was a very specific issue around John Bercow's behaviour to his staff. When it came to Brexit, I did feel the way he used parliamentary rules and procedures was, on a number of occasions, to advantage of those who wanted a second referendum. And there was a point at which we were close to getting our confidence and supply partners, the Democratic Unionist Party, to accepting the deal. And that was critical for a lot of my Conservative colleagues, so it could have got the whole thing over the line. And the Speaker declared that we couldn't put the motion to the House.
And because
we
of
lost
that, it
support.
slipped away at the last moment.
Yes.
So that's a little bit about the Remain side of the argument. On the Leave side of the argument, you say that Jacob Rees-Mogg took a sledgehammer to the Constitution in two suggestions he made to you during that period. What were they?
Well, the first was that what was happening was that the Remainers were trying to get legislation through Parliament to ensure we couldn't leave the EU without a deal, that there was no deal. And his suggestions were, in order to stop that, I prorogue Parliament. Of course, Boris Johnson later prorogued Parliament and found the Supreme Court found that to be unlawful. Or that if the Act was passed, I suggested to the Queen that she didn't sign it and give it royal assent. I rejected both of those. And I thought there was a general sense, and I think it's still in Parliament today with the use of what's called a humble address, which brings the monarch into more of a role in Parliament than there should be in our constitutional monarchy.
Boris Johnson eventually did a deal which resulted in a sea border between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK, something you fought very, very hard to avoid. Do you think, candidly, that he was putting his own personal position ahead of the national interest when he did that?
I think Boris wanted to get a deal. I had always said that the deal that he accepted with that border down the Irish Sea could not be accepted, in my view, by any UK Prime Minister because of the separation between Great Britain and Northern Ireland that it created. But he accepted what the EU had actually proposed in the first place and then claimed it was a great victory. And on the back of that, of course, he was able to say he'd done Brexit, and he on the back of aiming to get Brexit, he was able to get the very good election result he got in 2019.
Was he straight with us?
I think you have to ask Boris what he thought at the time of that. I mean, I think the question is, did he recognise the impact this would have on Northern Ireland, or was he just so keen to get a deal and to be able to claim victory? He just accepted it.
And it was, in your view, not a good deal in the end. It was a bad deal.
It was a bad deal, I think, as we saw from all the problems we had on the Northern Ireland Protocol. And Rishi Sunak came in and, of course, agreed the Windsor Framework, which has eased that situation and in many ways resolved those issues. But we had that period of time when it was really very difficult for Northern Ireland and difficult for people, supermarkets and so forth in Great Britain who were sending food over to Northern Ireland, all the checks and stuff that came as a result of Boris's deal. So that's why, I think my deal would not have been in that position and would have been better.